Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, as you know, if you've watched this show much before, largely my content is focused on political issues of one sort or another, but also, as a social scientist, a social psychologist, I do like to talk about scientific issues from time to time. And over the past year and a half that we've had the pandemic, my research has been focused on trying to understand how political ideology and culture relate to governmental as well as uh, citizens' responses to the pandemic. And some of the things that uh, research has looked at about this seem rather obvious. That uh, things like masks and vaccines and so forth have become very politicized, and if you look at where mask mandates are implemented versus where they're frowned upon, which states or localities have the highest or lowest vaccination rates, and so forth, you find a pretty striking relationship between uh, political affiliation, such as Republican or Democrat, and uh, people's willingness to, or people's rates of vaccination, of wearing masks in public indoor spaces, and so forth. But certainly there's a lot more complex and interesting relationships than that. But in any case, in observing how in observing public discourse about the pandemic, I can't help but notice, even among my colleagues on the political left, a tendency to have sort of knee-jerk, very superficial reactions to uh, different issues without having looked into them very deeply. Uh, in fact, just the other day, I encountered an instance where uh, somebody whose tweets I see a lot on Twitter, and appears to be very sort of anti-establishment and to the left politically and so forth, literally uh, seem to be basing his entire opinion on something he saw in a headline uh, in a Fox News article. Um, so So this fellow at Spittin' Venoms says, serious question, if 90% of all new cases are Delta, the Delta variant of the COVID virus, then why are we still talking about forcing people to take this thing? And points down at a headline taken from a Fox News article that says, Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine just 42% effective against infection amid Delta spread, preprint suggests. Goes on to say, for everyone that says 42% is better than 0%, the FDA does not agree with you. In their eyes, anything less than 50% is not acceptable. So as far as your argument goes, 0% is equals 42%. But by all means, let's keep shaming people and threatening violence on them. I don't know anybody who's threatened violence against people who won't take the vaccines. I have seen literal violence from anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers against people who support masks and vaccines. Just yesterday in Los Angeles, in fact. Um, but anyway, I'll just go on to read the rest. Or my favorite, hoping the vaccine hesitant and their families die from COVID. Yeah, okay, I've seen that. Um, but most people don't seem to feel that way. When will it be okay to stop calling people anti-science and start calling the science between Operation Warp Speed flawed? Um, well, I mean, you know, I don't know what could be more anti-science than literally basing your uh, conclusion in this particular instance on what a headline says. Um, and ironically, somebody elsewhere in this thread accused me of basing my opinions off of what was said in the corporate media, MSNBC and the like. And yet here is someone literally uh, saying nothing about even the content of this Fox News piece, other than the headline, um, let alone talking about the research that the article was about, or referencing that. Um, so going beyond the headline in the article, let's take a look at the actual article. Um, okay, so here it is. Pfizer COVID. Okay, I already read you the headline. COVID-19 vaccine findings were posted ahead of peer review. So, in other words, this article hasn't been peer reviewed yet. It hasn't been subjected to the study in the article written about it haven't been subjected to critical review by the researchers, fellow scientists yet. So we'll wait and see what happens. Um, this article goes on to say early findings posted ahead of rigorous peer review suggested the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine declines to 42% effectiveness against infection amid sweeping spread of the Delta variant, with the Moderna vaccine declining to 76%. So, one thing that this person didn't mention that, okay, so assuming that this is a real effect. Yeah, Pfizer declined to 42% based on data in July in Minnesota when the Delta variant became the predominant variant, whereas it had been much higher in preventing infection before. But the Moderna vaccine, the other mRNA vaccine that's predominantly used in the United States at this point, you still showed an efficacy of 76% in July. So it was down from, in the high 80s or low 90s earlier in the pandemic, but 76% is still pretty impressive. Um, so, you know, a conclusion to draw from this would, and assuming these statistics accurately reflect how these two vaccines are gonna um, do in preventing infection uh, in the long run. The conclusion is not drop the vaccines, but maybe focus on giving more people Moderna. But let's go a little beyond that and look at what else the article said. Okay, so Pfizer defended the vaccine and pointed out, you um, the vaccine continues to be highly efficacious in preventing COVID-19, including variants, and to date, no variant, including Delta, appears to have escaped the protection of the vaccine. So the article doesn't go into any further detail on what Pfizer said to them, but presumably what they're referring to is that there have been other studies of how the vaccines do against the Delta variant, and generally those other studies have found a much higher efficacy level in preventing COVID. Okay, but we'll come back to that later. Uh, so the author of this article goes on to quote Dr. Gregory Pollan, professor of medicine and infectious diseases at the Mayo Clinic, where the scientists who wrote this article and did this research comparing the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. They're affiliated with Mayo Clinic. Uh, so so he told Fox News, "We caution against drawing conclusions about vaccine effectiveness from a preprint study, which is intended only to be helpful to the scientific community and has not yet undergone the rigor of peer review." Uh, the authors of this study suggested several factors behind the differences observed among the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, including the dosing, meaning each mRNA 1273, that is Moderna dose, provides 3 times more RNA copies of the spike protein than BNT 162b2, the Pfizer vaccine, which could result in more effective priming of the immune response. So, in other words, they're saying, assuming that this is a real difference in effectiveness at preventing infection on the part of Moderna as opposed to Pfizer. Okay, well, here's a possible explanation for why that could be. There's a difference in the amount of mRNA material in the two vaccines, which may not make any difference against earlier variants of the COVID virus, but may make a difference with the Delta variant. However, as the author, I'll talk about what the authors say further in a minute, but this Fox News piece goes on to say the study has its limitations. The sample size wasn't representative, or I guess the sample wasn't representative of the U.S. population. And authors said other factors could have impacted the findings regarding reduced vaccine effectiveness, like waning immunity over time, the dynamic landscape of SARS-CoV-2 variants, or other factors that were not considered here. Our observational study suggests that while both mRNA COVID vaccines strongly protect against infection and severe disease, there are differences in their real-world effectiveness relative to each other and relative to prior months of the pandemic. The researchers called for larger studies with more diverse participants to guide public health decisions, including timing of booster doses. Certainly the researchers would not agree with this conclusion that Spit and Venom's draws here, that 42% is not meaningfully different than 0. Well, obviously 42% is 42% better than 0. And, if you play things out, in terms of the impact of multiple people being vaccinated, okay, so you have a 42% lower risk of getting COVID if you've been vaccinated with Pfizer, assuming that's an accurate figure. And so therefore, you have at least a 42% lower chance, because you're 42% less likely to get COVID, of passing it on to somebody else. And then, we may also need to take into account that, as I'll talk about more in a little while, because all of these vaccines, regardless of their efficacy in reducing the likelihood of infection, reduce the severity of cases, of breakthrough cases when people who are vaccinated do get COVID. Odds are, on average, over the course of their disease, they're going to be less infectious. They're probably going to have a less severe case, so lower viral load on average, and they're going to get over it sooner, so they'll be infectious for a shorter period of time. So it's probably more than a 42% reduction in likelihood of spreading the virus to somebody else. And okay, let's say that other person is also vaccinated. So they've got a reduced likelihood of getting infected by the vaccinated person who is infected. But let's say they get it. The same thing plays out. They have a reduced chance of transmitting it to somebody else, and so on and so on and so on. So even if it were the case, or even if it is the case that the Pfizer vaccine only reduces the odds of your getting COVID by 42% relative to an unvaccinated person, that has cascading effects that if a lot of people are vaccinated could result in a vast decrease in the number of infected people as well as in the severity of their infections. So, and I mean, if you look at the efficacy of the flu vaccines, it varies from year to year depending on how well they guess as to which variant of the flu is predominant that year. But it's often below 50% efficacy. Compared to not being vaccinated for against flu, and yet the CDC hasn't stopped telling people to get the flu vaccine just because sometimes its efficacy turns out to be less than 50% that year, because 42% is a whole lot more than zero, right? So I don't understand how this person, how he thinks this is a logical statement here. Um, well, let's dive a little deeper here and look at the actual article written by the researchers, on which the Fox News article was based. Okay, let me go up to the top. A comparison of two highly effective mRNA vaccines for COVID-19 during periods of Alpha and Delta variant prevalence. So, just from the title, you know that these researchers who did the study are not suggesting we throw out one or both of these vaccines just because maybe one or both of them don't work as well against the Delta variant as they did against the Alpha variant that was predominant, the one that started in Britain as opposed to the Delta variant which started in India. Even if it's the case that they don't work as well against Delta as they do against the Alpha variant, which was prevalent during the early months that this study was done back early this year, they're certainly not suggesting we stop using the vaccines. So they say, okay, we compare the effectiveness of two mRNA vaccines, one from Moderna and one from Pfizer BioNTech. Pfizer is an American pharmaceutical company. BioNTech is a German company. In the Mayo Clinic Health System, which is in Minnesota, but also several other states, over the time period from January to July 2021, in which either the Alpha or Delta variant was highly prevalent. So they said both vaccines were highly effective during this study period against SARS-CoV-2 infection. So overall, mRNA 1273, which is Pfizer, had 86% efficacy, and BNT 162b2 or Pfizer had an average 76% efficacy over the 7-month study period. And also, this is something beyond those headlines that you need to consider. They were also highly effective against hospitalization. Moderna produced a 91.6% lower likelihood of being hospitalized with COVID as opposed to unvaccinated people. And Pfizer gave people an 85% lower chance of being hospitalized if they were infected with COVID than people who were unvaccinated. However, in July, the effectiveness against infection was considerably lower for Moderna, down to 76% from the average of 86%, with an even more pronounced reduction in effectiveness for Pfizer, down to 42%, as opposed to the average of, what was it, 76%. Notably, the Delta variant prevalence in Minnesota increased from 0.7% in May to over 70% in July, whereas the Alpha variant prevalence decreased from 85 to 13%. Um, so, you know, these results certainly suggest it's possible that the vaccines, and especially Pfizer, don't do as well against Delta as they did against Alpha or against the original virus. Uh, they conclude in the abstract or summary of the study here. Our observational study highlights that while both mRNA COVID-19 vaccines strongly protect against infection and severe disease, further evaluation of mechanisms underlying differences in their effectiveness, such as dosing regimens and vaccine composition, are warranted. So they're saying, okay, well, assuming that this is a real difference in effectiveness against Delta, we need to further investigate, why that is. Maybe maybe there will need to be an increase in the dosage of the Pfizer vaccine in order to boost it up to the efficacy against Delta of the Moderna vaccine. We'll see. This study isn't really designed to answer that question. Now, bear in mind that this study looked at a lot of other variables besides just infection rates. They looked at comparisons between the two vaccines and between them and between vaccinated people and unvaccinated people for 5 different variables: SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19 associated hospitalization, COVID-19 associated intensive care admission, and COVID-19 associated mortality, death occurring within 28 days after infection. Breakthrough infection, well, that's kind of a subset of infection. So, 4 variables actually. Okay, let's look a little further here. Results. Okay, I've given you most of this before, but it's worth pointing out. Full vaccination with either vaccine was also highly effective against COVID-19 associated hospitalization, as well as intensive care admission and death. So for hospitalization, just to repeat, the average was 91.6% lower rate of hospitalization with Moderna as opposed to the unvaccinated, and 85% lower risk of hospitalization with Pfizer compared to unvaccinated people. For admission to intensive care, the risk reduction was slightly greater. For Moderna, 93.3% decreased risk of having to be put in intensive care if you were infected despite being vaccinated. For Pfizer, 87% lower risk of winding up in the intensive care unit if you'd taken that vaccine as opposed to being unvaccinated. And as for death, there were no deaths in anybody who took the vaccines in this sample of, I forget the numbers, but it was a pretty big sample. 43,895 Moderna vaccinated, 35,000 of them fully vaccinated, and 37,000 Pfizer vaccinated people, fully vaccinated, and similar sample size for unvaccinated. And out of those tens of thousands of people who were fully vaccinated, and I think for partially vaccinated too, none of them died. You know, I don't know about you, but I think cutting the risk of death that low is you know uh, if you are unlucky enough to get infected with COVID despite being vaccinated, I think that's a pretty good argument for saying that these vaccinations are worth taking. It's like nobody died in this study of tens of thousands of people, with either of the vaccines. Okay, and they go on to say, uh, particularly in July, uh, you know, Pfizer didn't cut hospitalization risks by as much as Moderna did. But uh, they found that risk of complications and severe disease was similar for Pfizer and Moderna. So, for example, the risk of being hospitalized for 21 days or more was the same across the two. The risk of you know, being admitted to intensive care was the same for both. Um, like only uh, you know, 4% of people who were infected with COVID wound up in ICU versus a whole lot more than that for people who were unvaccinated. And it didn't matter which vaccine you got as far as risk of being in intensive care. And again, nobody died. So they say, conclude overall, we find that in our study population from Minnesota, both vaccines strongly reduce the risk of infection and severe COVID 19. But individuals vaccinated with Moderna were about half as likely to experience breakthrough infections as individuals vaccinated with Pfizer. At least in July, that was the case. Um, but the rates of complications experienced by patients with breakthrough infections were similar, uh, regardless of which vaccine they were given. And they conclude this study further supports the effectiveness of both vaccines in reducing the burden of symptomatic disease, hospitalization, and death related to COVID infection. It's important to realize that most vaccines are not 100% effective, particularly against asymptomatic infections. For example, they make the same point I did earlier here. The estimated effectiveness of seasonal influenza vaccines has ranged from 19 to 60% over the past decade. And yet, you know, doctors and public health officials still recommend that you get the flu vaccine, despite it typically having a similar effectiveness at preventing infection to what Pfizer showed in the month of July in this study. Um, okay, so they go on to say we observed a pronounced reduction in the effectiveness of Pfizer, coinciding with the surging prevalence of the Delta variant. But this is very important to keep in mind here. This temporal association does not imply causality, and there are likely several factors contributing to changes in vaccine effectiveness over time. Consistent with our findings, a previous test negative case control study found that full vaccination with Moderna was less effective in preventing symptomatic infection with the Delta variant than with the Alpha variant, but it was highly effective against both. 88% effectiveness at preventing symptomatic infection with Delta versus 94% reduction in likelihood of infection with Alpha. So, you know, so there's actually a number of other studies out there that have shown that the Pfizer vaccine is way more effective than 42% at preventing symptomatic infection, and this is one of them here. So they go on to say several factors could contribute to the observed differences in effectiveness of Pfizer and Moderna. Differences in the formulation where basically there's more mRNA stuff in the Moderna vaccine than in the Pfizer vaccine, which could result in more effective priming of the immune response. And consistent with that, reported side effects from Moderna are typically a little more pronounced than those for Pfizer, although typically they're mild and short-lived in both cases. There hasn't been a head-to-head comparison of the neutralizing antibody titers elicited by Pfizer versus Moderna. But such a study could provide important context for our results. And finally, they say, while we did observe a recent reduction in vaccine effectiveness in July, we did not analyze the risk of infection relative to the date of vaccination. The reduced effectiveness could be due to waning immunity over time, the dynamic landscape of SARS-CoV-2 variants, or other factors that were not considered here. So, it could be that, let's say that on average people got vaccinated with Pfizer in April rather than on average in February or whatever it was. It could be that you'd still have found well over 50%, maybe 70 or 80% efficacy against infection with the Delta variant, which is consistent with what's often been found in some of the other studies. This is the lowest efficacy that has been found to date of the Pfizer vaccine against the Delta variant in terms of preventing infection. So we'll have to see. Our observational study suggests that while both mRNA COVID-19 vaccines strongly protect against infection and severe disease, so in other words, they're saying 42% is still significantly cutting the likelihood of infection, and Pfizer cuts likelihood of severe disease by much more than that. But there are differences in their real-world effectiveness relative to each other and relative to prior months of the pandemic, at least based on these study results. So we'll have to await the outcome of other studies. But as I said already, there have been other studies. There need to be more, but so just to show you one other study. This one looks like it's about 93% efficacy against Delta, and I believe they used Pfizer in this study. They just say a mRNA vaccine, but I think Singapore uses Pfizer. Anyway, my point is there are plenty of studies that have found greater effectiveness for the Pfizer vaccine against infection with the Delta variant of COVID. So, we'll have to wait and see, how things pan out, and hopefully future research will be able to sort out, to what extent any declines we see in efficacy of the vaccines are due to the enormously greater infectiousness of the Delta variant, where it's more than twice as infectious as the original uh, COVID virus, versus to what extent what we're seeing is a decline in efficacy against infection, among people who were vaccinated a long time ago, like 6 months or more. We'll just have to see. Um, again, uh, oh, one other thing I wanted to show you here. Just another example of why it's important to you know, dig deeper than just what headlines say. So the New York Times on July 30th uh, said, breaking news, the Delta variant is as contagious as chickenpox and may be spread by vaccinated people as easily as the unvaccinated, an internal CDC report said. Um, and as I was talking about on an episode a few days ago, in fact, the Delta variant is not quite as contagious as chickenpox. Um, Contrary to what a PowerPoint from the CDC that was leaked said, um, and you may be spread by vaccinated people as easily as the unvaccinated. It makes it sound like the vaccine just doesn't work. Um, as this scientist who is involved in developing vaccines says, this makes it sound as if vaccinated individuals are as likely to contract and spread COVID as easily as unvaccinated individuals do, and that's not what the CDC report said. Viral load is not enough to say there is comparable infectiousness between a vaccinated and unvaccinated individual. If vaccinated individuals were as likely to contract and transmit COVID as unvaccinated individuals, the vaccination effectiveness would literally be zero, and it's not. Post-vaccination infections can occur. Vaccines aren't 100%, but they prevent a vast majority of infections, transmission, and nearly all hospitalizations and deaths. And he goes on to cite the actual statistics from the same CDC leaked document that vaccinated individuals have a 25-fold reduction in risk of death, a 25-fold reduction in risk of hospitalization, and an 8-fold reduction of risk disease. So even if viral loads were equal in vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, which the research hasn't directly showed that, because the measure that they use as a proxy for viral load is not actually measuring viral load. But even if they were the same, if you're 8 times less likely to get COVID in the first place, right there, you've cut risk of transmission by a factor of 8, right? You can't transmit it if you don't have it. So he says, stop the misleading headlines, and to that we could add, stop jumping to conclusions based on misleading headlines. Just because the headline of a Fox News article says, study shows that Pfizer vaccine only 42% effective in preventing infection against by COVID. You need to dig deeper and look at the details to see whether in fact this is the case and what the authors of that research concluded based on their findings about not just Pfizer but Moderna, which in the month of July when Delta variant was prevalent still showed a 76% reduction in likelihood of infection relative to unvaccinated people. But again, the study's authors also said, we're not sure if this truly means that Pfizer is much less effective against Delta than it was against Alpha. Roughly, less than half as effective in preventing infection. And we also found it still works super well, irrespective of the data on symptomatic infection likelihood. It still works super well against preventing hospitalization, being in the intensive care unit, having severe symptoms, or dying. Literally nobody who took the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine died as a result of COVID in this study of tens of thousands of vaccinated people. So you have to go beyond the headlines to find that out. Um, you can't just jump to conclusions based on what you see in a headline. And it's unfortunate that even people who really should know better, like this person who tweeted these things out the other day, uh, you know, need to bear that in mind and dig deeper. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Please like and share and subscribe, and let me know what you think. I will talk to you later.